Hi there. Welcome to my talk for Social Ontology 2020. In this talk, I take another look at Einheuser's theory of conventional facts, which I think is a little underappreciated. My interest is in co-opting that theory as a theory of social facts, and then seeing if I can use some of its mechanics to make modest progress on a likewise underappreciated challenge for metaphysical theories of social facts that I'm currently referring to as the problem of cultural variation. In her PhD thesis from 2003 and a follow-up article from 2006, Iris Einheuser developed in outline a generic theory of conventional facts, meant to be applicable to, for example, conventionalism about mathematics, about ontology, about morality, what have you. Her interest was in controversial instances of conventionalism, like those just mentioned, but I'm interested in the application to a class of facts that's fairly uncontroversially conventional, social facts. Einheuser's theory repurposes a semantics for indexicals in the tradition of Kaplan. In Kaplan-style two-dimensional semantics, the truth of an indexical sentence depends on two indices, a circumstance of evaluation, a world, if you will, and a context of utterance. Given an indexical sentence, you need to take up information from the context, like who uttered the sentence and when and where, and use the semantic rules associated with its indexical terms, their characters, to assign reference to these indexical terms. Then you can compare the resultant propositional content to the world or to any world to see whether the sentence is true of that world. If you want to hear a bit more about why this sort of thing gets called 2D semantics, you can watch my explainer video. Right. Einheuser isn't so much interested in semantics as in metaphysics, in the obtaining or not obtaining of facts rather than the truth or falsity of sentences or the reference of terms, where indexical sentences depend for their truth on both the circumstance of evaluation and the context of utterance. A conventional fact, according to Einheuser, depends on two indices called a substrate and a carving. A substrate is much like a possible world, but a world denuded of conventional features of the kind we're interested in. So if we're thinking of conventionalism about ontology, our substrates might be blobby worlds. If we're talking conventionalism about normativity, they'd be worlds lacking normative facts. Alternatively, we can think of substrates as worlds described in a limited vocabulary that doesn't allow us to capture anything about, say, normative facts. The conventional facts that substrates yet lack can be filled out in various ways, and how they're filled out is going to depend on the conventions we have. A systematic way of filling out the conventional facts for a given world is what Einheuser calls a carving. It's a function from a substrate to a fully-fledged world. If we're conventionalists about normativity, then the space of carvings is made up of all the ways we can carve up the non-normative facts in a substrate to arrive at a set of normative facts. A possible world of the familiar kind is modeled by Einheuser as an ordered pair of a substrate and a carving. The set of substrates and the set of carvings are both spaces that we can define recognizably modal operators over. First, we can speak of facts being true at all substrates, S necessity, or at some substrates, S possibility. This is the counterpart of ordinary metaphysical possibility in Einheuser's framework. But we can also speak of facts being true at all carvings, C necessity, or at some carvings, C possibility. We can also accordingly muse about what would have been the case in two ways. We can think of what would have been the case at this substrate if we had carved things up differently. That would be a counter-carving supposition. Or we can hold our carving fixed and consider a different way for the substrate to be. That would be a counter-substrate supposition. Now, most often we would just be interested in what's the case of the actual substrate by the lights of the actual carving. So what makes some way of carving up the non-conventional facts the actual carving? Well, it is determined by features of the actual substrate. Substrates contain people, and these people have what Einheuser calls conceptual practices, or also conventional practices, or just conventions. These conventional practices are assumed to uniquely determine a carving. This part of her view remains very abstract. She says very little about what she thinks conventional practices are, and she doesn't delve much into the mechanism by which these conventional practices succeed in uniquely determining a carving. Really, the notion of a conventional practice is a bit of a placeholder for Einheuser. The important thing is just that it be some kind of property of our collective behavior that can be captured in the limited vocabulary in which we can capture substrates. So even though substrates don't yet have any conventional facts in them, they do have conventional practices in them. That means we can look at a substrate, see how people in that substrate do things, assuming that there are people in that substrate, and derive a carving, which we can then apply to that substrate or to some other substrate of our choice. In the default case, we look at the conventional practices in our substrate, derive a carving from that, which would be the actual carving, and then apply that to our actual substrate to determine the actual conventional facts. Now, what is the utility of all this? Mainly, it can solve puzzles that arise for conventionalism. Here's a classic one. If you're a conventionalist about, say, mathematics, you want to say that somehow what the mathematical facts are depends on how we do things. A first pass at expressing this might be the following conditional. Had our conventions been different, 2 plus 2 would have equaled 5. But this immediately sounds a bit off. Mathematical facts are necessary and conventions are contingent. So we can look at a possible world where the conventions are different, as the antecedent instructs us to, but we should expect to see the same mathematical facts there as we see here. 2 plus 2 will still equal 4. So as an expression of mathematical conventionalism, this seems very misguided. However, armed with a two-dimensional theory of conventional facts, we can distinguish two counterfactuals that we might be dimly grasping at with the above sentence. In one, we assert that in worlds where behavioral facts are different, mathematical facts are different. This is a counter-substrate conditional, and it looks false. In another, however, we assert that when we carve up our substrate differently, we get different mathematical facts. That is a counter-carving conditional. It is not obviously true, but it's also not obviously false in the way that the first one was. The latter is what the conventionalist should try to express. To drill down a bit more, as people usually think about counterfactuals, the antecedent clause is one that makes us consider another possible world, most commonly the closest, i.e. the most like the actual world, of the possible worlds that makes the antecedent true. If we read the antecedent, had our conventions been different, in that way, the counterfactual does not look true. But if Einheuser is right, had our conventions been different, can be charitably interpreted a device that makes us consider another carving, rather than another world or substrate. A carving shifting operator, if you will. And then it might well yield a counterfactual that's true, assuming that there is some carving in the space of carvings that makes 2 plus 2 equal 5. Now, natural language doesn't equip us very well for disambiguating between the two sorts of counterfactual supposition, which is what a viable conventionalism requires us to do. Hence, we need to define up some sort of machinery, and Einheuser does that. Okay. Social facts, which is what I'm interested in, are a clear example of conventional facts in the sense that Einheuser is concerned with. That is, if we use conventional in a fairly broad, non-technical sense. If we think of conventions as characterized by a specific theory, say Lewis's theory, then it's quite an unobvious question whether all social facts could be explained by appealing to conventions of precisely that shape. But that the way that social facts turn out depends on the way that we as a society do things in a way that, say, the chemical facts don't, that should not be a contentious claim. By treating social facts as conventional facts and treating the latter using Einheuser's theory, we have a quick and dirty metaphysics of social facts, which I will apply to an issue that I'm interested in. Okay. In one of my 5-minute videos, I introduced the issue that cultural variation presents for social ontology. If population A, call them the A-landers, puts in place a principle by whatever metaphysical mechanism you fancy, to the effect that only those who are 18 or over are adults, and population B, the B-landers, put in place a principle to the effect that only those 21 or over are adults, how do we not end up asserting that Alice, who's 19 years old, both is and is not an adult, which would be a logical contradiction? Now, the obvious answer is that we make some qualifications by saying, for example, that Alice is an adult for the A-landers, or by the lights of the A-landers, or in A-land, or according to A-landish culture, or whatever, but not an adult for the B-landers. The theoretical issue is then to say something about what we do when we make such qualifications, and how our metaphysics backs that up. The issue seems not to have been addressed very much in the social ontology literature, or at all. I've been thinking through some options, which I'm not going to try and catalog here. I haven't really worked out the most satisfying way to carve up the options yet. Also, it would take too long. Rather, I want to explore a specific train of thought, making use of Einheuser's theory. I make no claim that this particular train of thought leads us to the overall most plausible responsible problem, but I think it's illuminating on some level. Okay, so. It's not too hard to see what the basic application of Einheuser's metaphysics to this challenge will be. We interpret phrases like for the A-landers as carving shifting operators, playing a role similar to the ones that allow us to engage in counter-carving supposition. If we're B-landers, the phrase for the A-landers takes us from whatever our carving is to the carving that the Einheusers have come up with. Anything within the scope of that operator is then evaluated by the lights of that carving. The line we take then is that we don't get contradictions like Alice being both an adult and not an adult. For social facts, like conventional facts in general, only obtain relative to a carving. As a toy formalization of this way of thinking, and I do stress the word toy as there's a variety of ways of approaching this, we might say that any sentence S expressing a social fact is prefixed with a modal operator indicating the carving at which it obtains, a carving index. So something like you see here on the slide. So from something that's under an operator like that, we wouldn't simply be permitted to derive the thing that's under the operator. You can't sort of just unlink it from the operator. For approximately the same reason that we can't derive P from possibly P. So even though we have this here, Alice is an adult at the A-landers carving, and Alice is not an adult at the B-landers carving, we can't derive the conjunction that she is an adult and also not an adult. Okay, so that's good. Now, as a first pass, this carving-dependent view of social facts does what it's asked: accommodate the phenomenon of cultural variation without allowing rampant inconsistency. That being said, I'm not quite satisfied. One thing our theory ought to do, and doesn't do, is to capture somehow that there's a difference between a merely conceivable way of carving up the social facts and the way that the social facts are actually carved up by someone, somewhere. Only in the latter case, I put it to you, do you get real social facts. For example, the sort of things that an anthropologist could get published. But this first pass doesn't yet offer a way of marking that distinction. For all we've said so far, a social fact is real if some carving applied to the actual substrate yields that fact. That's enough to make it obtain at that carving after all, and that's as real as social facts get. But this means that even the deliverances of merely conceivable carvings are going to give us real, albeit carving dependent, social facts. Social facts will be very abundant as a result, though consistent. Among other things, this probably doesn't make very good sense of publication practices in the social sciences unless you're a real pessimist about those. I think what we want is for metaphysics to somehow make more out of the fact that some carvings are carvings selected by the conventional practices of real people and some are not. Now, I'll make a suggestion about that in a moment. Just as a quick aside, I want to note this carving-dependent view of social facts leaves quite a lot of details open as regards the semantics of claims about the social. One way to further work this out is to go along somewhat contextualist lines. We could think that predicates referring to social properties are indexicals of the sort, so that what property is picked out by such a predicate is determined by the carving that is being applied. The carving then being treated as an element of the conversational context. Alternatively, social predicates could always pick out the same properties, but the truth conditions of sentences about the social could depend on the carving that is supplied by the context. This latter option would be more like a version of new relativism a la Macfarlane. Nothing much hangs on this for present purposes, but it would have consequences for example, what the view predicts about disagreement about social facts. Right, that's the end of my aside. Moving on. In setting out the view, her own view, Einheuser touches, en passant, on a complication for her assumption that substrates uniquely determine carvings. So to quote, conceptual practices vary across cultures, and to some degree also across members of the same culture. So a substratum may potentially ground a multitude of carvings, end quote. She doesn't want to get bogged down by that complication. So Einheuser says that we should consider carvings to be determined not by substrates as such, but by centered substrates, centered on populations to be exact. That is, when we look at a substrate, we pick a specific population, and it's only their conventional practices that get taken into account. Thus, uniqueness, or some semblance thereof, can be recovered. Now, Einheuser says no more about it, but I think we can make centered substrates do a bit more work for us. With them in the picture, the theory gives us two distinct routes from our actual carving to an alternative carving. We can consider a substrate where people, perhaps we ourselves, do things differently, extract the carving from those conventional practices, and apply that carving to our substrate. But we can also recenter our own substrate on a different population, extract the carving from their conventional practices, and apply it to our substrate. Now, either way, you get a carving, of course, so it may not seem to matter much. But it's interesting because it serves as a way of marking out metaphysically, within the set of possible carvings, a subset that's precisely relevant for our theoretical purposes. The social facts that we're minded to regard as real are precisely those determined by some carving that we would get by recentering our substrate on some actual population. Now, the base model Einheuser metaphysics held that the actual world is the ordered pair of the actual substrate and the actual carving. That is, the carving selected by the actual substrate. With centered substrates, formerly ordered pairs of substrates in population, we get multiple carvings out of a single substrate. We can think of this as giving us a cozy little neighborhood of worlds, worlds produced from a single substrate by centering it on each of the actual substrate's populations, abstracting the carving, and pairing it with the substrate. These, we might say, are the real worlds. And one of them is our actual world, the one whose carving is selected by the population that we're in. Alternatively, slightly differently, you can describe them all as actual worlds, in which case there's going to be actuality sub population A, actuality sub B, etc. Now, while phrases like for the A-landers can be thought of as carving shifting operators, they should be thought of as special ones that work quite differently from those that we find in counter-conventional conditionals. They move us to another carving by recentering the substrate on another actual population. And thereby, they move us only to other worlds in our neighborhood. And the propositions in their scope describe ways that the social world really is, assuming that they're true at least, and not just ways the world could have been. Now, that is most of what I want to say for today. It's kind of modest progress, I am sure, but interesting nonetheless, I think. I just want to make a couple of remarks to end. So first off, there's another way of thinking about what the carvings do metaphysically, which I haven't gone with, but also seems kind of elegant to me, but may to others seem more extravagant. Rather than having social facts obtain at carvings, we can quantify over the carvings and say that if a social fact obtains by the lights of some carving, it just obtains full stop. That, of course, takes us back to the situation that we wanted to avoid, a wildly inconsistent social reality. But we can bite the bullet on that and then think that our qualifying operators, like for the A-landers, as things that restrict the domain of social facts we're considering, namely to those facts carved out by the carving that's in operation, which again, we could think of as a parameter of the context. This view would be analogous to a four-dimensionalist view of time, where our quantifiers are usually restricted to things that are contemporaneous with us, but we can shift those restrictions by using operators like yesterday and at time t or in the future. All right, so second, and finally, I've said very little about the notion of populations as it appears in Einheuser's view, and so does she. There's potentially a lot to be said about populations as entities, and they're surprisingly little discussed in social ontology. I just want to note that to serve the theoretical role that they do here, the theory of populations we appeal to has to be at least somewhat selective. The reason is that if we allow ourselves to freely recombine individuals into populations, we might have the resources then to gerrymander a wide variety of carvings just by aggregating the behavior of cleverly selected individuals into conventional practices. How real a worry this is rather depends on the theory of conventions that we appeal to, or to what sort of properties of populations we appeal to in the place of conventions. But it's something that we need to watch out for if we try to work out this view in detail. All right, thanks very much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.